Up, we have Dr. David Abramson. He is joining us from New York, the Big Apple. He's dialing in to give this presentation. So he's an associate professor at New York University's College of Global Public Health, and he's also the director of NYU's program on population impact, recovery, and resilience. So today he's joining us online, and he's going to be talking about the importance of capital when communities are recovering from disasters. Okay, so I'm going to turn this over. Okay, here, say something so I can see if it's picking you up.
Okay, good morning, everybody.
Good, perfect.
You're able to hear me.
Yep, it's perfect.
Okay. Well, thank you for letting me come in remotely. I appreciate it. This is what you see on your screen right now is sort of my backyard. It's Washington Square Park, and you could see the arch, and if you look up Fifth Avenue, you could see the Empire State Building sort of a little bit in the distance. But I'm quite familiar with the room that you're in now. I've been there, hosted workshops there. It's a beautiful spot, and I know you're right across from the Gulf. So it is the perfect venue to talk about resilience along the Gulf Coast. Today what I'm going to talk about briefly is really an introduction to how to think or how I think about community resilience. So while these topics could also apply to individual level resilience, I'm going to focus this conversation on community level resilience. So first, this is sort of the standard opening, which is what do we think about when we're talking about resilient communities? And a lot of times what we come up with is really something quite idealized or aspirational, things that we would like. And so you can imagine that if a community faces a stressor, the things that you would want that community to be able to do is to resist the stress, whether the stress comes from an oil spill, a hurricane, a man-made hazard, whatever the stressor would be. If it can't resist, you would want that community to be able to adapt to the stressor, or you'd want the community to recover quickly. All of these things would be happening in order to accomplish three basic goals of any community or society. So this is where we want to get to. We want our societies to have the capacity for economic engagement. We want people to be able to be socially engaged in the areas that they live. And lastly, we would like people to have the capacity for emotional, intellectual, and spiritual growth. These are all very nice and aspirational ideas. These are really, what we build communities for. And ultimately what we want is we want to have people living in communities that have the opportunity to lead meaningful and productive lives. So that's the ideal. We should all live in a community like that. The reality, though, is often a lot simpler. And so in the short term, the reality that for a community that has faced a major stressor is clean up the mess, get back to business, get back into housing, educate and support your children. So you want to do some very fundamental, practical, logistical things. And so for these practical matters, resilience means not just those great aspirational ideas of having spiritual, intellectual, emotional growth, it means cleaning up the debris. And so what I'd like to suggest to you, both the people that are in the room and are online, is that one way to think about this is that it takes a certain amount of capital. And often we think of capital as money, but it's not just money. And so here are four types of capital. And as I said, these could be expressed at a community level or at an individual level. But I want to think about them at a community level first. So let's start with economic capital. So you can imagine that a community that has access to financial resources and assets would be better able to get back on its feet, to resist, to adapt, to recover quickly, because it's able to marshal the economic resources that it needs. At a human capital level, it means that there's a population who is physically and mentally healthy, highly functioning, productive. And so for each one of these capitals, this is an attribute that you are seeking. And so you can imagine when you want to build resilience, you want to make sure that you are contributing to this capacity in your community. When we think about social capital, we're talking about both formal and informal institutions and networks that promote collective cohesion and self-efficacy. And I'm using a lot of these sort of social science terms, but I'm going to illustrate what I mean by these in just a moment. And then lastly, let's go back. Can we get the political capital too? There we go. The political capital is capable governance, an institution that can help a community identify, acquire, and distribute resources. And this really plays out in a lot of different ways. And I tend to find that this notion of political capital is often the least talked about. We talk a lot about social capital, and I think that is an important part of it, but I think it's not the only part. We think it seems obvious that you need to have the economic resources, but to me, both the human capital and the political capital are really critical to being able to help a community be resilient. And so 3 very quick illustrations. If you think that a community could either adapt, resist, or recover quickly. So imagine an adaptive community is one whose may have been primarily an agricultural industry, but all of a sudden that industry was really impacted by a catastrophic natural event. And then collectively, the community decides to retrain its workforce and turn its attention to an entirely new industrial base. This is, again, an idealized illustration of what an adaptive, resilient community would be. And here it's a community that is using its political capital with effective governance, its human capital by engaging its workforce, and its economic capital by redeveloping its industrial base. A resistant community would be one that has engaged in a lot of mitigation to create structures that could withstand a substantial earthquake. So if you even contrasted the Chilean earthquake with the Haitian earthquake of a few years ago, the Chilean earthquake was a much more significant quake in and of itself, and yet the buildings were able to withstand because it was more resistant. And then if you think of a rapidly recovered community, and one that I'm sure will be quite familiar with to many of you there, you could think of the New Orleans East community, the Vietnamese community there, that was able to build back its housing and markets in many ways stronger and better after the devastation of Katrina. And they did this really predicated on their social capital. There was a lot of cohesion in that community, their human capital, which was a tremendous amount of collective self-efficacy, and the fact that they had this combination of social and political capital that was all organized around a very effective faith-based organization, in this case, Mary Queen of Vietnam, the Catholic Church in New Orleans East. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to take you and walk you through an actual event, the Joplin tornado of May 2011, very quickly, as an illustration of how one community proved to be very resilient. And so before the disaster, we're talking about a community that is a regional economic hub for 4 states. It's sort of at the corner of Missouri, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Arkansas. It's got a population of about 50,000 at night, a daytime population of 250,000. There are 2 major regional medical centers that sit right across the street from one another. There's a student body, about 6,000 students in 10 schools in the Joplin School District. So it's a really, mid-American thriving city. So the impact was an Ef5 tornado, the strongest recorded tornado that we have that came through. This shows you what the impact was of a 6-mile, what they called the scar, that cut across their community, so 6 miles long, 3/4 of a mile wide. It was called a grinder, meaning it took 22 minutes and sort of stalled a little bit as it went through the community, doing even more damage. And this is what it looked like immediately afterwards. It was unbelievably devastated. 7,500 homes were lost, and of those 7,500 homes, 4,000 were destroyed completely. 3,500 had major destruction. Of those 10 schools that were there, 6 of them were completely destroyed, including the high school, and 4 of them suffered significant damage. Of the 2 hospitals that sat one across the street from one another, one of them, the Mercy St. John's Regional Medical Center, a 367-bed hospital, completely destroyed. It moved several feet on its foundation. It was such a significant impact.
This meeting yesterday, I may or may not have told you already separately.
I'm hearing some background noise here. I'm not sure if it's in the room. Okay. The other hospital, thankfully, was untouched by the tornado. So because of the precision of the tornado, it hit one hospital and destroyed it completely, left the other one standing. 28 churches destroyed, a third of their residents displaced. And so the recovery began immediately. And one thing that they did very quickly is they immediately capitalized on pre-existing community efforts that they had. And this is one of the, I think, the major lessons learned that any community can learn about resilience, which it begins before the event occurs. It will express itself after the event when the stressor has happened, but it's built beforehand. So they happen to have had a community effort called the Bright Futures Community Initiative, which connected the schools and the faith-based organizations, and they had a great website, and so they immediately repurposed the website to be able to take donations and assign volunteers, and there was a lot more about this particular initiative that we'll come back to. They set up FEMA trailers. They created a community advisory recovery team called this Citizens the CART that was really using civic and political leaders and business leaders already in the community. And what they managed to do is, if you look at this before and after, the top of the slide is showing you what it looks like really about 2 weeks after the tornado, and the bottom is 2 months later. So they cleared the debris in 67 days, which was astonishing. And one of the things that was clearly effective in helping to accelerate the recovery for their community. The high school, and this was also an amazing story, 2 days after the tornado hit, the superintendent of the Joplin School District, and this is really, it hit at the very end of their school year. In fact, the seniors were at graduation ceremony when the tornado hit. And so 2 days after the event, the superintendent makes a public announcement that the school system will open as normal in 87 days, even though he had lost 60% of his building stock. And so indeed, on the first day of school, the students from the high school went into a reopened shopping mall, and they managed to get through their first couple of years in that shopping mall. And then a few days or about a couple of weeks later, the football team for the high school commemorates their rebuilding effort. And so all of this together in a fairly short period of time reflects a community that was not necessarily able to resist the tornado, because they weren't, and it's not even so much that they were adapting, although they did adapt a little, but what they did was they recovered incredibly quickly. And so just for a couple of minutes, I want to consider what made Joplin resilient, thinking about the capital. So the first thing is their social capital. They used these networks of community groups that had already been engaged in strategic planning, economic development. They had been doing leadership training, so that Bright Futures initiative that I illustrated early on actually had a leadership training that was occurring. They trained 23 community leaders before the tornado happened. They were already in the process of building community capacity. And so they were poised to be able to leverage their social capital. Their political capital, they had very effective governance. They had a strong city manager system with a weak mayor. I'm not saying that the mayor was weak. This is just a political term for the city manager made most of the decisions. They were a very efficient government, and they had this cohesive group of civic leaders, the ones that formed the cart, that were both business, political, people knew them, they were accustomed to working together, and they had the support of the governor. All of these things together were sort of adding up to them being able to be resilient. And so for each one of these things, you might be asking yourself, does my community have those things? And if not, what can we be doing to build those things into our community? They're going to benefit a community on an everyday basis, and they'll make it ready for a major event. Economic capital, maybe this was a fluke, but their tax base was really dependent more upon commerce and not on their property taxes. Had it been dependent upon their property taxes, they would have been in trouble because the value of the properties plummeted. People were not going to be able to make tax payments. Instead, the school district happened to be relying upon those property taxes, but they fortunately had just had a big bond raising to rebuild and go through a capital expansion. And so even though some of the school buildings that were destroyed had just been built or rebuilt, they were ready and had the plans in place to essentially do it again. And then the human capital is maybe the most important. Again, a little bit of a fluke. This is a very homogeneous population. There's not a great deal of diversity in Joplin, and it probably worked to their benefit. They had a number of common institutions that were accustomed to working together, and particularly the school and the churches working together. So Bright Futures was an initiative that actually had the churches supporting efforts in the schools. I think different communities, would regard that, positively and maybe less so, but on the other hand, it worked particularly well for Joplin. And this is something that when we had gone down to do we did a case study of Joplin, which I'm drawing from for this, and we spoke to this woman who was the director of development, who herself is a New Orleans native and was quite familiar with life after Katrina, and she was really struck by the fact that, as she said here, if you want a seat at the table, you pretty much have it. There's not been anybody that I've seen here denied access to the process. And so that seat at the table is important, I would say, both before an event like this and after. So to the extent that any community can foster that type of community engagement before, that's really getting at the building community resilience. And so I want to end, and I can't resist showing you actually a program that a colleague and I run down in the Gulf Coast called Shoreline, which is a youth development project, and that friendship oak is right outside your window. If you look to your left, you won't be able to do that online. But if you look to your left, that's all of us at the Friendship Oak. And to me, this is also a way of building community resilience, is invest in the youth in a community. And with that, I'll stop. And Larissa, happy to answer any questions if any arise.
Great, thank you, David. That was great. And we pointed to the tree so everybody can see it out the window.